Welcome to our members and friends of Parkview Golf Club, and thank you for joining us on this webinar with renowned strategist, scenario planner, and author, Mr. Clem Sunter. Please note, all microphones will be muted, but you are welcome to use the Q&A facility. We'll select some of your questions depending on the time available at the end of this discussion. We would like to thank Flow Communications for their kind offer to host this webinar on our behalf and allowing us to widen the number of participants. We have Clem logging in live with us here. Thank you, Clem, so much for your time this evening, giving your thoughts on the current situations in South Africa, likely scenarios, and also possible solutions. Congratulations, by the way, Clem, on the publication of your latest book with Mitch Albury called Thinking the Future. We're looking forward to your view of the current situation and where to from here. Over to you, Clem. Clem, sorry, 1 second there, Clem. We just need you to unmute your microphone there, please, Clem. There we go.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Lovely to be with you. And particularly, I remember the golf course so well. It's a lovely course. And so it's wonderful to be invited to speak to you tonight. I'm going to be talking to you about this book, which was published at the beginning of July by Penguin. And I wrote it with a young man called Mitch Albury. And we wanted to just tell people generally how to think about the future. And we based the book on the giants who've really contributed to how one should think about the future. So we mentioned Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, the Stoic philosophers and others as we go through the book. And that's why the subtitle is Perspectives from the Shoulders of Giants. And I would now like to talk about two of them who really started the whole scenario planning process, which we believe is the correct way to look at the future. In 1960, a man called Herman Kahn, who was an analyst for the RAND Corporation, which advised the US Armed Forces, wrote a book called On Thermonuclear War. And it was portraying a scenario of a total conflict between the Soviet Union and America, and showed that a large part of the world would be destroyed. And Herman actually invented the term scenario planning because he lived in California. He was close to quite a few movie producers, and they used that term to suggest a summary of a movie plot. And he felt that by adding the word planning, he could use it to show that instead of trying to forecast and predict the future, you could write a story about it like a movie plot. And that's what he did with this book on thermonuclear war. It was a huge success in the US, but more important, 2 years later, America and the Soviet Union nearly did go to war over the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Russia had planted a few missiles in Cuba. And Khrushchev and Kennedy were at each other's throat. And a lot of people say that this book actually educated both sides about the downside if they really did go to war, and it helped promote the idea that one should try and find one's way through this problem without a military conflict. So Herman Kahn became a famous name, and he opened his own academy in America. And my mentor, the person who taught me about scenario planning, went to his academy, a man called Pierre Wack. He was a Frenchman. And after he had been taught by Herman, he decided to join Royal Dutch Shell in London and open a scenario planning function for the oil market there. And during the 1970s, he actually captured both oil price shocks, the one in 73 and the one in 78, in scenarios for the management of Shell. They didn't listen to him first time round, but they certainly listened to him on the second one, and they did a few changes to their management strategy. And as a result, they made a lot of money out of the oil price going up from $12 a barrel to $40 a barrel at the end of the 70s. And Pierre became a legend in London. And we, as Anglo-American, the largest mining company in the world at that time, decided that if the oil market could use it, so could we on our various markets like gold and diamonds and other minerals. So we asked Pierre to come to Johannesburg because we knew he was retiring from Shell to tell us about scenario planning. And he spoke to our executive committee and he entranced them. He looked like a futurist. He had a goatee beard, he had hooded eyes. And the chairman at the end of the discussion turned to me as the secretary of the committee and said, "Won't you look after the function for us?" And I said, "Fine, Gavin, that would be great." And so I began this long relationship with Pierre that lasted into the early 90s when he retired as a consultant. And we did some serious scenario work in the mid-80s, including formulating the high road and low road scenarios for South Africa, the high road of negotiation leading to a political settlement, and the low road of confrontation leading to civil war and a wasteland. And I guess the thing that Pierre taught me was that if you really want to capture particularly unusual futures, you must look at multiple futures. You can't just try and forecast one future. You've got to look all around you. As he would say, you have to take off all those assumptions which you have and just look clearly and at the peripheral to see what could really happen. Anyway, Pierre retired and the process died down in Anglo-American, and I was quite disappointed. But then a young woman approached me in 2000 to say she was writing a thesis on scenario planning for small business. Would I read it? Her name was Chantal Ilbery. I really enjoyed reading it. And I said to her, let's write a book together. And we collaborated, and it was published in June 2001. And it was called The Mind of a Fox. And the reason we chose that title was because Isaiah Berlin, who was a professor of philosophy at Oxford, had written a book called The Hedgehog and a Fox, and he quoted Archilochus, an ancient Greek poet, who said, "The fox knows many things, whereas the hedgehog knows one big thing." And we felt that this was a superb metaphor for what we were trying to do, which was move away from people forecasting the future, a single future, one big idea, the hedgehog, to what a fox would do, which would be to consider multiple futures. And I guess that is the biggest takeaway from our methodology, which is that it's not that you have to be absolutely accurate. There's a book out at the moment called Super Forecasters, published in 2015, with America's top futurist as one of the authors, called Philip Tetlock. And he used the hedgehog and fox analogy too, and said, you know, you can be a foxy futurist by giving probabilities to your forecast and all that. We prefer to say foxes really ignore forecasting. They are much more interested in the driving forces, the forces that are driving the present into the future, and then looking at where those forces could actually end up. And so that's what we have been doing over these past almost 20 years. And I then decided with Chantal's son, Mitch Ilbery, to write this book about the philosophers behind our thinking. And I would like now to go through the flags, as we call them, that all our clients around the world are telling us are the forces that we should be watching out for in terms of considering different scenarios. The first one is the religious flag, which we mentioned in The Mind of a Fox. We had a letter to George Bush in the book in which we said that if he wanted to think as a fox, as president of America, he had to consider some very unusual futures, one of which was a massive terrorist strike on a Western city. And it happened 3 months after we published the book with 9/11. And it was because we noted the growing competition between the major religions of the world. And that religious flag is still very much alive today. Unfortunately, with the withdrawal of the Americans from Afghanistan, you're seeing the Taliban taking the place over. You're already seeing incidents in Afghanistan, and therefore it's a very powerful force in the Middle East. We had the recent war between Israel and Hamas. And of course, there's the ongoing rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And so, particularly in the Middle East, this driving force or flag has to be watched very carefully in terms of possible future scenarios. The second flag is what we call the red flag. It's made up of the old communist countries, Russia, China, and North Korea. With Russia, I guess the most important thing to say is that they provide 25% of Europe's energy needs. And so Europe is highly dependent on a good relationship with Russia. But of course, Russia, with the annexation of Crimea, completely changed that relationship. And there are sanctions between Europe and the UK and America against Russia. And so it's pretty fraught at the moment. And of course, the other thing is that a lot of the cyber attacks are coming out of Russia, which are seriously concerning for some businesses providing critical infrastructure and services in America, because they're disabled for 24 hours, 48 hours. I mean, in a sense, this is a completely new warfare, digital warfare. The second nation, China, as we say in the book, is going to become the largest economy in the world before the end of this decade. And that is huge. I mean, consider it. We've had the West in charge of the world since the 1700s. And now it's going to be a Far Eastern country taking the helm from America. And this is going to create all kinds of different scenarios. And it's particularly crucial to look at the relationship between America and China because of another flag that I will be mentioning shortly. The third nation is North Korea. I mean, Trump went on the photo shoots with Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, talked of denuclearization, but none of that has happened. And so North Korea remains a very uncertain driving force in the Far East, particularly in terms of the relationship with South Korea. The third flag is about the aging of quite a few nations in the world. We now have 8 billion people in the world, and Japan and Europe particularly are now aging communities. Japan is actually the oldest country on earth. And this is making people much more cautious in those countries, and their economies are growing slower as a result. So this gray flag is actually meaning that America, which is younger and more resilient, is pretty much certain to grow faster over the next 10 years than Japan and Europe. But it's also promoting something which we're seeing on our television screens at the moment, which is a gilded cage mentality, where people want to, put bars around themselves to protect themselves from illegal immigrants. And it's all over British television at the moment, how many immigrants are arriving from France and what are people going to do about it. And, it's going to remain a problem because of the number of people in the world. And, it's going to be incredibly difficult to create a gilded cage around your own country. The next major driving force is around anti-establishment culture and the fact that we are living in a very unequal world. In fact, the pandemic has really exaggerated that. You not only have within countries a wider degree of inequality, but also between countries, you have that too. And that has unleashed a whole series of new forces in the world, particularly in the political context. You have Trump being elected out of the blue against the predictions of all the pundits in America in 2016. Brexit happened in the UK because Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage were very clever at exploiting the anger of the North against the South, and particularly London. So there is a much greater degree of anger and distrust. And of course, it's amplified by social media around the world. And one has to look at what the consequences of that particular driving force are going to be. But I now come to the force that is, for me, the biggest one of all. It's this whole point around the sustainability of our planet. We call it the green flag. And we've been talking about this for years. And two incidents in the last month have really put it dead center. The first is the extraordinary temperatures in Canada around Vancouver about 3 weeks ago, where they nearly reached 50 degrees centigrade. Can you imagine that in Canada? And the second is the extraordinary rainfall that we're now seeing in places like Germany, Belgium, and Holland. And again, it's not just the flag you look at the world's response. And at the moment, yes, you have the Paris Accord and America is back in the Paris Accord. But what you haven't seen is the kind of concrete steps that need to be taken to reduce carbon emissions. And John Kerry last night was saying that we haven't even started yet, and was maintaining that you have to build a solar plant as every single day that is large as the largest solar plant on Earth at the moment. So, we haven't even started on this particular flag. And indeed, in the book, we talk of the scenarios that can flow out of it. Obviously, the positive one is paradise regained, to quote John Milton, where we really take climate change seriously. But the worst scenario we call pandemonium, because that's what you're going to see. You're going to see climate refugees fleeing to countries that are habitable and all kinds of other things. So, this is the one to really bear in mind when you are thinking the future. The last flag that we've raised over the years is the idea of another pandemic. And of course, we've had that with the coronavirus in 2020. And we produced in the beginning of last year 4 scenarios for how this pandemic can play out. The first we called Much Ado About Nothing, because that was what Trump believed. He kind of felt that it was just a common flu, and why is everybody getting so upset? And there was a considerable amount of people in the United States that felt that way. But then, of course, the hospitals in New York and London were totally overwhelmed, and it certainly wasn't like the common flu. And indeed, 4 million people have died in the pandemic, and nearly 200 million people have been infected. The second scenario we called camel's straw, which is where the pandemic broke the camel's back. And luckily, of course, all this money in terms of government relief has flowed into the global economy. The markets have been virtually at record highs. And so, we've been saved from, the kind of collapse that we had in 2008. But that scenario is still out there because there's no doubt that inflation is ticking up as a result of all this extra money. Governments now have the highest national debt to GDP ratios that they've had for many years. So if interest rates rise because of inflation, that will cause a real problem too. So we're not in any way scribbling the camel's straw scenario. It's got to be watched carefully. And of course, recently the markets have been wobbling a bit because of fears that with the new variants that we have and the fact that vaccinations haven't sort of been completed yet. There's still a large chunk of most countries' population without vaccinations, that we could still see a downside to the pandemic. The third scenario we called Spain again. It's where a more lethal variant comes into play. It hasn't at the moment. We've had more contagious variants, but not a more lethal variant. And therefore, you can give that a low probability. But one must remember that with the Spanish flu 100 years ago, the reason so many people died, more than 50 million, some people even say 100 million people died in that pandemic, it was because a later variant was more lethal. But we give a low probability to Spain again, as we call it, as a scenario. The last one is the one that's in play in most countries. We call it tightrope, walking the tightrope between lives and livelihoods. And that's what most countries are doing. And they're doing it in a pretty muddled and confused way. But that's the way it is because the future is so unpredictable. Even places like Australia, which have had a fantastic record, they've got a very fragile future at the moment because it only takes a few cases and New South Wales closes down. I mean, when are they going to actually open up to foreigners again? So, we've got to watch very carefully the walking the tightrope scenario and how it can play out. Which really brings me now to South Africa and what we've been through with both the pandemic and then, of course, that dreadful looting and destruction we had very, very recently. We basically offer South Africa two scenarios for the future in this book, and I'll just read you a bit about one of them. But before I do, I'd like to talk about one rule of the game, a driving force which is absolutely there, which has to be taken into consideration in these scenarios. And that is that the nature of work has changed from what it was last century. In last century, big business created hundreds of thousands of jobs. All you had to do, particularly when I was young, was get your CV, wave it in front of a big business, and you get a job. But automation and robots and all the kind of new technologies have meant that big business is nowhere now the major creator of jobs. It is small business and micro enterprise. In America, the small business organization there has just come out with the fact that 2/3 of the jobs being created in America right now are in small and micro enterprise. So it is a rule that cannot be ignored in terms of South Africa's future scenarios. And I'd like to just read something that we wrote in the book before we get to the scenarios. We said South Africa right now stands at an economic crossroads after years of corruption and state capture, combined with the disruptive impact of COVID-19. The coffers are virtually empty, and this is unlikely to change anytime soon. We are at a tipping point where the path we take in the immediate future could define our future for decades. And that's where we are now, because we obviously hadn't had the looting and all the destruction at the time that we wrote this book. And we offer two scenarios for the future of South Africa, bearing in mind that rule of the game about the changing nature of work. The first one we call people's economy. And this is what we say. We call it people's economy to convey the message that the work achieved by Nelson Mandela and others before and after the dawn of South Africa's democracy constitutes unfinished business. In this sequel to the watershed event that was the 1994 general election, the country now achieves economic freedom for all as a necessary complement to political freedom. The government creates an inclusive economy with a new generation of young entrepreneurs at the helm. And that is the real message we want to convey with the people's economy, that Cyril actually takes this very seriously, in fact, even more seriously, the pandemic, because it's probably an even higher risk to this country's future. And so he sets up an entrepreneurship council in this country, particularly with CEOs who founded business, like Adrian Gore of Discovery, people who understand what it's like to start a business from scratch. And like he does now with the pandemic, and appears on TV and says this is what the progress is being made. In this scenario, he would do precisely that and tell us how many new businesses have been created every month, which province is showing the most original way of creating businesses. And we do transform our economy, but in a way that really, really helps entrepreneurs. For example, we do believe that at least 20% of the supply chain of any major business should be used to nurture small businesses. We should have e-stock exchanges in the major cities. We should have financing units set up by the major banks in the rural areas and urban areas. And equally, we've got to somehow merge the township economies into the mainstream economy. We actually quote Hernando de Soto in the book, a savvy Peruvian economist, who said that the key is to get the informal sector out of the shadows. So, yeah, it's very important to understand what we mean. I did a debate with Julius Malema in 2016 at the Cape Sun hotel at a dinner. And I said, I'm just as much of an economic freedom fighter as you are, Julius. It's just that I have a totally different concept of economic freedom, which is releasing entrepreneurs to create businesses. And we have some incredible entrepreneurs. I mean, Elon Musk was educated at Pretoria Boys High, and he's now the second richest man in the world. He lives in America, but we have Siubelela Zuza here, who had a minor planet named after him by NASA because he provided a more energy-intensive fuel than even NASA had produced for rockets. So we have the material to go through an entrepreneurial revolution, but we've now got to make it happen. And that means everybody putting their hands to the wheel. But equally, it means that Cyril has got to lead from the front with an appropriate council of advisors behind him. The downside scenario we call cautionary tale. And I'd like to just read that because, you know, it allows you to reflect, you know, what the risks are. Here, South Africa experiences rising popular anger caused by an economy that is stagnant, exclusive, and cursed by a dismally high unemployment rate. This leads to further disunity and widespread violence, with a possible endpoint of total anarchy in the chain of causation. So there you have it. And we are at this very critical moment. And so, yeah, hopefully the people who decide policy will read this book, see what a people's economy is all about, and actually make it happen. So I hope I've given you a feel for, how thinking the future is different, particularly to the book that was written by Philip Tetlock called Super Forecasting, because we're saying that actually to think the future, you should be considering multiple futures based on the kind of driving forces that you have identified. The ones that you're certain about, which we call rules of the game, and the ones which are totally uncertain in where they're going to lead, which we call the key uncertainties. That is the critical thinking process, we feel, for looking at your own future, the future of your business, and of course, the future of the country. And yeah, we also have tried to steer people in terms of how to do this, with scenarios for climate change in the book, and also those two scenarios for South Africa. So I hope I've given you a feel for what we've got to do now, and I would love all of you to consider how you can possibly make a people's economy happen. And I'd like to end with a benediction, particularly when you've got that short putt on the green. May the fox be with you. Thank you very much.
Right, Clem, Mr. Sunter, thank you so much for sharing that kind wisdom with all of us this evening. It's insightful, it's greatly appreciated, and as you say, what an interesting time we find ourselves in. And I think that what I took the most from your chat was the matter of we're in such a critical few weeks, if you can even call it that, day by day over the next few weeks, months. It's going to be very interesting to see which way we swing in terms of the decisions that Cyril and his cabinet have to make. If there's time, if you have time, Clem, I do have a few questions coming through. Do you mind if I feed them to you? Fantastic.
For as long.
I've got one from Jeremy Clark. Clem, you've mentioned that John Kerry stated that little is being done. How does the average person try to convince the politicians to start the process of amending their actions to provide the required investment for the changes required?
Yeah, Jeremy, hello. Nice to have a question from you. And I know that John Kerry is committed. He was committed last night, and he said one of the big problems is going to be to convince China to come on board. So that's why I talked about the China-US relationship being so vital at the moment, and in terms of the future of the planet, because China has, I think, said that it's only going to be sort of carbon neutral as opposed to increasing carbon emissions, flat, so to speak, by 2030. And Kerry's saying that's not enough. We've actually got to cut carbon emissions. So I'm not sure how one goes about getting it to the powers that be. We do mention Greta Thunberg in the book, saying that she showed that you could get into that big circle beyond your control, through social media and things like that. And maybe that's the way we've got to convince the politicians to do something. We also say, and this is an incredible statistic that we picked up for the book, that 1%, the richest 1% of the world's population emit as much carbon as the poorest 50% of the world's population. So what are we going to do to make rich people consider their lifestyle and actually say, well, I'm not going to go on that particular overseas trip because it's going to increase my footprint, carbon footprint for the year. Maybe I won't have that particular rich meal because if I look at all the constituents, they were all flown in from somewhere else. In terms of the clothes you buy, whatever it is, it's going to be more than the politicians. It's going to be everybody considering, what am I going to do to change my lifestyle to reduce my carbon footprint?
Fantastic. Clem, I have another one from Stuart Mulroy. Thank you, Clem. With the violence in the last 2 weeks, would you say that we have taken a big step down the scenario path of the cautionary tale, inverted commas?
Yeah, I did an interview last week with Alec Hogg on this book, and he asked me what were the odds of the two scenarios. And I said, when we wrote the book, we gave 70% to the people's economy, and we gave 30% cautionary tale. And immediately after that violence, we changed the odds to 50-50. And yeah, he said that's quite sobering. I would say now, because of that incredibly positive cleanup operation where you saw South Africa at its best and coming together and communities, doing extraordinary things to repair the damage. I would now say, but that is exactly the spirit that we need to create the people's economy. So I would move back from giving it 50% to maybe the 30% again, because of the incredible pushback that we've seen.
I think just touching on a topic that you mentioned in your answer there, one question from Rob Krebo. Hi, Clem, there's been great collaboration among all race groups in the country to help clean up last week's destruction. How strong and lasting do you think this could be?
Well, it's just the start. And the great thing, as we noted in the late 80s, when I've given these presentations on the high road and low road in the mid 80s, and a lot of people said, you're wasting your time. The ANC will never negotiate with the National Party. Why is Anglo sending you on the road to spin this fairy tale? And of course it happened. It happened in the 90s, because when push came to shove, South Africans can create an extraordinary future, and they did. But we always said you must not only tackle the politics and become a democracy, you've got to tackle the economy. And unfortunately, we haven't tackled the economy yet. We're at the economic crossroads right now because we've run out of money. And that's why we've now got to get together. And certainly the cleanup showed that we have that incredible ability to combine on a non-racial basis to get things right again. And so I just hope that can be the start of building this people's economy. But I come back to my point, which is that it's not just all of us in our own ways and our businesses thinking, how can we do this? It's also up to the government, and particularly Cyril, to make a young entrepreneurship revolution at the center of policy going forward, because the only way you're going to get our unemployment rate down to a reasonable number, maybe 5 to 10%, is by creating millions of new businesses. Big business is not going to do it. Government hasn't got the money to hire lots more people in the civil service. And yes, we can have things like basic income grants and stuff to help people out of hardship. But actually, most people just want a career, a job. And yes, the whole economy is not going to be entrepreneurs. But if you have, say, 10 to 20% of the economy as entrepreneurs, the rest can work for them.
You've answered, actually, funny enough, the next two questions here from Mark Colley and Daniel Barnard, who also touch on that and ask, hi, Clem, thank you so much for the insightful presentation. And the query is, education is obviously key to the people's economy? Do you believe universities and schools are doing enough to prepare the youth in our country to join the digital economy? And how do you believe they need to adapt? I think you've touched on it in your answer there.
Hang on. James, let me just say that the last chapter of this book is called Planting Seeds. And it goes through the whole change that has to be made in our education system to make young people think more entrepreneurially. Mitch and his mother, Chantel, they facilitated a session with people in South Africa, other African countries, the UK, towards the end of the last year, where they built up some different scenarios. But the key to the good one was to accept that technology has changed dramatically for schools to teach. And therefore, the curriculum and everything should be around what the new technologies can do. And then, of course, looking at what kind of skill set you want your pupils to have when they actually leave and join the real world outside.
Absolutely. Again, education being just a fundamental piece in our correctional path, I guess, if you could word it that way. We've got another question here from Simon McLennan. Clem, how should corporates respond to Thunberg's critique of the fairy tale of eternal economic growth?
Yeah, this is in terms of climate change.
Correct.
Because the that is a very good question, because of course the way that the politicians are putting it is that there'll be so many new opportunities arising from creating a green economy that will create millions of new jobs. So that even if the fossil fuel industries start going into decline, these new industries will dominate. I don't know. I simply don't know whether that is correct or not. But obviously, the point of the holy grail in our society is economic growth and development and raising material prosperity. Yeah, we've got to do all that, but we can't kill the planet at the same time. And there have been some incredibly striking events recently showing that we're not talking about 2100 when these things start happening. They're starting to happen now. I mean, I think what all those German villagers must be going through, whose villages have been destroyed by the floods. The only country to escape fatalities was the Netherlands, because they're used to cities being flooded on their coast. They built dikes, they've done the whole thing. But, Britain, in fact, in London, there was a huge flood about 2 weeks ago, but it didn't get talked about very much in Kensington. And it flooded a lot of people's houses because, of course, there's so much basement development in a rich suburb like that. People are going to realize that things are not all right. I mean, Oregon right now is going through the most terrible, terrible fire. I mean, it is ghastly. Yeah. And so we're going to have a balance between obviously trying to promote further prosperity, particularly for poor people in the world, but against a situation where we've got to change our lifestyle to save our own planet.
Absolutely. Sure. We have another question coming in from Stephen Hayton, and probably not an easy one to answer, but he's asked, considering the incredibly low levels of wealth and spending in South Africa, how would the small enterprises founded by these entrepreneurs survive when the demand for products beyond the absolute necessities is so low? Cool.
Yeah, it's a question of gaining momentum. I would agree at the moment that we are in a very tough state, and unfortunately, we've had 9 to 10 years of virtually no economic growth in South Africa at all. We had some good years when Nelson Mandela became president. They continued with Thabo Mbeki, but unfortunately, after that, we've had all the bad things happening, which is corruption, state capture, and of course fairly low growth. So I would agree that this is not the greatest moment to put forward the idea of a people's economy, but we've got to build it up, and we've got to have the right principles in building it up, and one of them is to really support the young entrepreneurs. And you can't, the whole point of an entrepreneur is you can't tell in advance what bright idea they're going to come up with and connect to the market. That's it. But you can certainly, as we answered in the previous question, you can give them the skills to do so. But for me, that is the only approach. I was invited to show the Chinese Communist Party, how scenario planning worked, and I went to the Central Party School in Beijing, which is their inner sanctum. It's where all the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party are trained. And because so few foreigners go to the school, after we'd had our meeting, they showed me around the school, and they'd taken down the slogans of Mao Zedong in every single lecture room that I visited. And I said to them, his portrait is in Tiananmen Square, his remains, and yet you seem to have forgotten him. And the guy said, well, if you look at those quotes carefully, they're from Deng Xiaoping, because Deng Xiaoping came in 1978 when we were the 100th ranked economy in the world. We're now number 6. And he said he insisted on 2 things. Number 1, he said, we've got to improve our infrastructure. And that's what we as the party must do in terms of new roads, new ports, new airports, all that kind of stuff. That's what we've got to do. And the second thing he said is we've got to give freedom to the Chinese people to create wealth for themselves. And that was it. And in a sense, that's the formula that we've got to have, because guess what? You look at Russia, you look at Venezuela, you look at Cuba, who are still overwhelmed by the old socialist model. They've gone nowhere. But China's going to be number 1 by 2028 because they allow people to create wealth for themselves.
Absolutely. Sure. Clem, I can see many questions coming in here talking about the people's economy. And I'm going to read one here from Neville Barber. Do you believe the outcome of the Zondo Commission is likely to bring any meaningful benefit to something like a people's economy, or is it just wasting money?
No, it's not wasting money, because, we get back to that point, the story I've just told. We have to have a properly functioning state in order to create the people's economy. You need the platform, and that platform must be an honest platform. It cannot be riddled with corruption. And so, I think this is a very important commission. But, of course, there have got to be consequences for the people who've been, found out by the commission. So, no, I feel that it is incredibly important, because you've got to have both sides. You've got to have that platform, and then you've got to see how you can create this new generation of young entrepreneurs.
I think it also takes us to the structure in cabinets and in presidency. We have a question here from Vainant Dupree. Dear Clem, thank you very much for your time. I agree that under Cyril, we might see a people's economy come to be. Can you see anyone in the ANC post Cyril? He cannot be president forever, in brackets, who can take South Africa forward from an economic perspective?
I would hate to say who that would be. I'm not au fait with the sort of the younger talent in the ANC, but I sincerely hope that there are people who at the moment are holding maybe positions in municipalities or maybe in the provinces, who can actually come forward and have the kind of charisma that Julius Malema has got, even though I disagree fundamentally with what he wants to do, other than the phrase economic freedom, which I do believe is absolutely right. We need some, as the question implied. We need some young, charismatic people within the ANC to come forward and help Cyril.
We do.
Quite right.
We do. And leads us on to our next one from Derek Chapman. How and or who will fund this people's economy that you talk of? What we know about local banks is you can get as much as you need when you don't need it.
Yeah, well, that's why I talk about e-stock exchanges and crowdfunding and things like that. So you would have the kind of eBay system working in different centers, and then there are initiatives that have been taken by big companies to help small business. I mean, in my own company, Anglo American, we started in the mid-90s a program called Zemeli, where we looked at what was being used underground, and we thought that could be done by a small business. And we did, in fact, help entrepreneurs with their businesses. And it was a great success. And so, I think that, big business must actually think, what can we do in terms of our supply chains? And the reason we went into it in Anglo was because Japan, we had identified in those high road, low road scenario exercise as having a dual logic economy where you had this close relationship between big and small business. Toyota, it's a global brand. It finally assembles the vehicle, but a lot of the components of the vehicle are manufactured by small business in Japan. And again, as we say in this book, we should be mounting a buy local campaign, because of course that will save on carbon emissions as well, because you won't have to transport everything from overseas and stuff like that. So yeah, we've got to have a serious talk about where the money comes from for all these businesses. But I want that conversation to take place, because it is the only way we're going to get out of the trouble we're in. Because if we just go back to the normal economy, it's going to be exclusive. We're going to have an unemployment rate of around 30%, and amongst young people of 50%, and that is not a sustainable solution.
Fantastic. Well, Clem, Mr. Sunter, I think that just about brings us to the end of the session tonight. If I can personally thank you again for sharing your wisdom with us. I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the attendees here. We most greatly appreciate everything that you've shared here, and I can say for myself, we absolutely hope that these positive outcomes come to action. And as you say, let's push for better education, push these entrepreneurs, and hope for the growth to come in these times. But thank you, Mr. Sunter. It is greatly appreciated. Really do thank you.
Thanks, James, very much. And as I said, may the fox be with you.
Cheers, guys. Thank you again. Bye-bye.